Hello and welcome to News from Nowhere, Scotia's weekly news podcast discussing the headlines shaping Scottish politics. Today is Sunday the 14th of June. We are each respectively very tired. It's the day after Scotland's opening World Cup fixture. We are not talking about the Tartan Army today, but a host of very, very interesting stories, some of which are right up our alley. Rory, how are you getting on?
I'm great. Couldn't be better. 28th minute winner from Super John McGinn. I'll take it.
Fantastic. Sam, what about you? How are things?
Yeah, I'm absolutely knackered. Thanks, Rory, for making us do this at 9 o'clock in the morning on this on the Sunday. But also pleased with last night's result. So
Devoted to the cause, so we are. A couple of things before we jump into this week's headlines. Scotia runs on the support of kind-hearted people like some of the listeners to this show. We launched a fundraiser this week, which has so far been very successful. We're trying to add 25 new paid patrons to our list before the end of June. We are well on our way, but what we need is a couple of people who are tuned in today to donate that £5 a month that helps us make podcasts like this one, as well as our flagship show, Nest of Fear. If you're not in a financial position to donate £5 a month to the podcast, then you can support us by reviewing the show wherever you're listening, be that Spotify, or giving us a like and a subscription on YouTube. As ever, we've got a WhatsApp channel and a newsletter where you can stay up to date with what we're up to. The link to those are in the show notes. Let's dive in to the headlines first. So this is the segment we introduced last week where we're just going to touch on a couple of stories shaping the news agenda this week. I'll start before I pass to Rory and Sam. I'll start with the fact that Scottish local government faces a shortfall of £530 million in 2026-2027, according to the Accounts Commission. They warned that councils have to, quote, stop, reduce or significantly redesign services in light of that big budget gap. As I say, 530 million. When you couple that 530 million pressure with additional cuts coming from the Scottish Government over the next 5 years, the Accounts Commission say that councils risk becoming financially unsustainable. The council with the largest budget gap, perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly given it's the major population centre in the country, is Glasgow, with a gap of £86.7 million. It's worth saying that this general budget gap of £530 million is down from a gap of £647 million last year. However, it's still a sizable sum that will lead to devastating cuts across the country without significant investment in Scotland's public services. And with that rather grim news, I'll pass to Rory.
I'm afraid it doesn't get much more exciting with me, Coll, or optimistic. The Scottish Government's annual carbon emission statistics were published this week, which were somewhat depressing. The carbon emissions fell by 1% in 2022, down from 2% in 2023. I mean, it adds to evidence that we're now in a phase of sort of climate frozen progress or policy retrenchment, you might say. But you wouldn't know that from the Scottish Government, who've been celebrating this as if it's, in comparison to 1990, rather than sort of the slow steps that they've been taking. And effectively, what they've actually done is really just celebrate the closure of Grangemouth, if you think about the times that are coinciding there. So, yeah, the Scottish Government celebrating climate progress, grinding to a halt, and the closure of our industrial refinery. Sam, your turn to brighten the day.
And in other news, a 2-year freedom of information battle by the Ferret yields details about the meeting between Angus Robertson and Israeli Deputy Ambassador Daniela Grudsky in 2024. The Scottish Government had tried to keep sections of the minutes of this meeting secret on the basis that their publication might harm relations between the UK and Israel. But the Scottish Information Commissioner ruled in April that all the information must be released, and it was published earlier in June, I believe. Topics discussed at this meeting included climate change and renewable energy, bringing Israel's world-leading technology to NHS Scotland, and promoting more tourism to Scotland from Israel. Thanks, Angus, for speaking on our behalf. Back to you, Cole.
Yes, important that we highlight the work of the ferret, because I think it has been an incredible shift getting those minutes out of the Scottish Government over that 24-month period. Is, as you say, Sam, it doesn't get any better or more optimistic with this polling for the Scottish Labour Party. Ipsos have run some numbers following the election and found that 30% of Scots think Anna Sarwar should resign immediately as Scottish Labour leader, while the remainder think he should continue. That's 21%, 27% unsure. So it's not like there's a broad base of support in the country willing Anna Sarwar to stay on as Scottish Labour leader. Meanwhile, most people in Scotland think someone other than Keir Starmer should lead Labour into the next general election, a whopping 68% of Scots. But it's not like there's much support for Keir Starmer's likely successors. No potential candidate, be that West Streeting Angela Rayner or Andy Burnham, has an approval rating in Scotland of above 25%. Everyone's unfavourables are above a third. Andy Burnham, perhaps unsurprisingly, given his rhetoric around the north, which tends to stop at Hadrian's Wall in his conception, but nonetheless maybe to some years does include Scotland, has the highest favourability rating of just 24%. So that's really not saying much about Labour's chances in the event that they are able to shift off the dead weight of Keir Starmer and reinstall somebody else.
And yes, meanwhile in England, the Filton 4 cohort of anti-genocide activists have been sentenced to a collective 25 years for causing over £1 million worth of criminal damage during their civil disobedience action at the Israeli arms, the offices of the Israeli arms firm Elbit Systems. The reason the sentences were so high is that the judge added a terrorist connection qualification to the crimes, despite the jury not being told that the terrorism connection was being considered by the judge during the proceedings. And back to you, Cole.
Yeah, that's probably the in a series of depressing headlines, that's probably the most depressing. I mean, a series of people arrested on criminal and charged with criminal damage to be sentenced as terrorists without any input from the jury is a staggering portrayal of our civil liberties and indeed of the right to a free and fair trial. So it's a story that we will return to, I think, because it does seem of particular importance. Moving on to the big stories this week, or the ones that we are going to talk about over the next 20 minutes or so. Let's start with Israeli interference in the Scottish election. John Swinney has been reportedly targeted by Blackcore, an Israeli tech firm claiming to, quote, shape narratives during the Scottish election. That Blackcore Israeli tech firm spread misinformation throughout the campaign across around 256 fake accounts, leaving more than 1,400 comments on both John Swinney's personal Facebook account and that Facebook account and X account, and that of his party, the SNP. This was revealed by a French government agency, their cybersecurity agency, Viginum. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but there we are, who found that Blackcore had also meddled in French elections targeting France Insoumise and the US elections, particularly that New York mayoral race that saw Zoran Mamdani elected late last year. Fake account comments across all three cases. This is an interesting story, not least because it puts a lot of pressure on the Scottish political and media class to follow these stories up. State interference in elections has been a major preoccupation of elements of our establishment over the last 10 years. We're never done hearing about Cambridge Analytica, the Russians and the Iranians. The question now is, will Israeli interference via Blackcore be met with the same response? And let's be honest, it doesn't look like it off the bat. The Cabinet Office has not commented on the allegations, and they've been out now for a couple of days. They refused to comment, the UK government. Also, John Swinney, for his part, said it was deeply concerning, and he spoke in broad and general terms about misinformation during the election campaign. He wasn't prepared to go after the Israeli case in particular, and I think that it is important that we do for reasons that I'll come on to talk about. But Sam, what did you make of this story?
Yeah, so it's pretty bizarre in a way, and I just wanted to start by saying that officially speaking, it's not clear who hired Blackcore. I think that this French verification organization that you mentioned has qualified that, um, uh, and on that basis, it's hard to infer exactly what the actors behind this are, because it could well have just been a very wealthy individual that had a grievance against both Zoran Mamdani and John Swinney. But although, having said this, we know, of course, that the Israeli intelligence services, the Israeli government themselves do have an enormous and very well-funded information warfare campaign, commonly known as Hasbara. And yeah, as you mentioned, the range of the targeting of Blackcore is really strange. You've got the Scottish election, you've got the New York mayoral election, and they were also involved in targeting with bots several LFI candidates in the French local elections in March. So obviously there's a tendency to target figures broadly on the left, and I imagine figures that have come out opposing the Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza and across the occupied territories. But my main takeaway from this is that there's something kind of weirdly feeble about it. Blackcore described themselves as an elite influence cyber and technology company built for the modern era of information warfare. Which I find it really funny, because their tactics are kind of much less like the kind of cognitive influence campaign on social media in the way that Cambridge Analytica really were, and it's much more just like a kind of cyberbullying operation. This notion of just getting a few a couple hundred bots to just leave nasty comments in people's figures Twitter posts. It's a bit silly, clearly very ineffective in almost all their cases. Obviously, Zoran Mamdani was elected with a huge mandate as mayor of New York, and I don't think that Blackcore are responsible for the SNP losing their, handful of seats at the Scottish election, and they are still the largest party. So I think this kind of goes to show how kind of finished, at least the moral conversation, the public opinion conversation is about Israel, really, on the ground, at least. At least in Scotland. I think the vast majority of people's minds are really very already decided on this issue. So basically the remaining strategy is just kind of a coordinated intimidation, and that may change a few individuals' behavior to make them not want to stick their neck out on the issue of Israel if they think that they might be susceptible to this kind of online harassment. But it's not going to substantially alter the conversation, I don't think, on the question of Palestine and Israel. What do you think, Rory, about this weird story?
Yeah, I think you're right to highlight the sort of feebleness of it. I mean, if I wanted to hire somebody to, put hate comments on the bottom of a politician's social media accounts, I'll just ask my dad, and he'd do it for free, probably. So I don't know how high tech this really is, but I think the context in which this has happened is quite prescient. On the one hand, you mentioned it, Sam, about the ferrets ongoing FOI request. And the meeting between Angus Robertson and the deputy Israeli ambassador to punt quote unquote world leading technology. This is an example of, obviously it's not the Israeli state in this case necessarily, but if this is an example of the sort of world leading technology that Israel is trying to punt our way, then I don't know what that says about our ability to negotiate good trade deals, I guess, regardless of not who it's with. But then there's that context, and there's also at the same time the context around John Healey resigning, which we're going to get onto in a second, over the sort of non-increase to defence spending, which the Labour government has been really trying to hammer down this commitment to 3.5% of GDP commit to defence spending. I mean, if anything, I think it highlights the daftness of spending, orienting all your defense spending towards arms manufacturing, towards nuclear weapons, towards this heavy industry, when the real threats to Scotland's national security, to the UK's national security, are cyber. And if you wanted people to feel secure about themselves on this wee island that we live on, you would be investing in the infrastructure to protect against hacking, to protect against election interference like this, and also ensuring that we have not only sort of tech sovereignty and tech independence from quite a lot of bad actors. So many of our local authorities' IT systems are relying on things like the Amazon Web Services, which crash, and similarly, Microsoft as well, not exactly the best actors either. And we've already seen the local authorities in France decouple themselves from Microsoft as a sort of tech provider, move towards something a bit more open source. And I think this is a direction that Scotland should think about taking as well, because if we're relying on the whims of billionaires and of supposed tech entrepreneurs in America who might have particular political interests aligned with the likes of Donald Trump, etc., that's a very precarious situation to be in, very akin to our relationship to nuclear weapons in this country, in the fact that we have to rely on the Americans to actually do anything with them. And again, if you want to secure our defense in this country, cybersecurity, tech sovereignty, and the last thing would be energy security, and ensuring that our energy infrastructure is not creaking at the seams and is not susceptible to threat in the same way that they think they're trying to push the narrative that we are, as to being susceptible to threat by sea type thing. So yeah, I think the timing of this story coming out is very interesting and really draws attention to all of this. And if anything, it highlights the sort of the SNP's poor answer to defense questions, is that they are in this sort of NATO bounded world, where everything has to be seen through the lens of defensive offense and nuclear weapons, rather than thinking about actual practical things that a small nation like Scotland should be taking to defend ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, the points you make, where I think they're particularly salient, because they come in a week where the US government, citing national security authorities, has issued an export control directive to suspend all of Anthropic's Fable 5 and is it Mythos 5 activity, right? Which is just an example of how dependent our tech is on these companies, who ultimately are beholden to the interests of a volatile US state. A couple of points before we move on this question of Israeli interference in the Scottish election. I think Sam's right in the sense that destabilisation of this sort is actually a central pillar of Israeli impunity, right? So it might be the case that the reaction in Scotland suggests a significant shift with regards attitudes to Israeli impunity, but I think that actually Israeli impunity is sustained by virtue of interventions like this, in no small part, and by virtue of the industry that Israel has been able to cultivate for doing things like this. So between 2021 and 2023, around 56 governments around the world contracted a wide range of Israeli spyware firms. Now, Blackcore aren't a spyware firm at all. They're something different. But these two industries, one of which specializes in misinformation, the other of which, as I say, develops spyware systems like Pegasus, which we know a lot about because it's made headlines in the last 5 years, are very, very strongly interrelated. So Pegasus is the famous example. It's the example of the spyware program, which allowed, when procured by governments, procured by the FBI, for example, it allowed agencies to access huge amounts of data and activate cameras even on the devices of the individuals that it had access to. And something like Team Jorge, right, which is a network, a covert team of primarily Israeli contractors, is an outgrowth of that same sector which breeds Pegasus, that same Israeli spyware sector. And Team Jorge have been found to have manipulated around 30 elections at a national level through both hacking and misinformation campaigns. They've been successful, they say, in 27 of those 33, I think, to be precise, election campaigns. They work quite closely, Team Jorge did, with Cambridge Analytica, for example, who we know have intervened in both Britain and the US. They provided opposition research to Cambridge Analytica. Team Jorge are a covert and very difficult to identify network of people, led by a guy called Tal Hanan, who's an Israeli businessman. But I think this is an interesting example of how this side of the Israeli security industrial complex interacts with Europe and with Scotland. And you're right that it's a small scale case, but I assume it's a test case. I assume LFI are a test case too, because in the wider context of attempting to influence those national elections that Team Jorge and others definitely do, you need to run test cases, and those test cases might be as banal as bullying John Swinney on Twitter. But I think it's important that we contextualize this not just within our own national confines, but within that global picture, which is that this is a significant reason why countries, governments, courts will not move against the state of Israel, because ultimately there is an incentive provided by something like Pegasus, for example, that has become central to or certainly did for a period become central to the national security architecture of a whole lot of states, which was built and developed and updated in Israel, not to go after the people who design and give you this tool which is central to your national security. So it takes us back to Rory's point about sovereignty, and about the importance of developing it in Scotland. And we'll see how this story develops. We'll return to it when it is updated, when we have more information about who might have commissioned Blackcore to target John Swinney. But I think it's worth dwelling on just in that context. We will move swiftly on to a similarly dispiriting story, actually. This week it will have escaped no one's attention that John Healey, the British Defence Secretary, resigned from Keir Starmer's cabinet in a significant blow to the Prime Minister's ever-diminishing authority, citing his failure to invest in defence adequately. John Healey criticised the fact that Keir Starmer had backloaded promised defence investment in the Defence Investment Partnership. Sam, have I got that right?
The Defence Investment Plan, I think it was. Yeah, people, all the bloody defence journals kept going dip, 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 dip. So you'll be excused for not knowing what it actually meant.
Defence Investment Plan, which backloaded this promised investment, which wasn't good enough for John Healey, who resigned, as did his deputy, Al Cairns. So I think this is an important story, but what is perhaps more important in the context of the drive to war that we talk about so often on this podcast is not, in fact, that there are warmongers like Healey and the Labour Party who are desperate to go further and faster with regard to the production of British bombs and bullets, but that there is very, very little opposition to that narrative. There is none, in fact, from the SNP, whose Westminster leader was quick to jump on Healy's resignation as an opportunity to both bash Keir Starmer and develop this war drive narrative. Dave Doogan, as I said, the party's Westminster leader, said Keir Starmer is putting Scotland's safety at risk by failing to deliver the vital defence investment that is needed in the face of growing international threats. The resignation of the UK Defence Secretary at a time of global crisis is utterly damning for the Prime Minister, and it will be the final nail in his sorry time in office. Yet again, the Labour government is in chaos, and it is putting Scotland and the UK's defence in jeopardy at the worst possible time. So cementing the very narrative the SNP themselves have in the past sought to dismantle as they drift ever further from the anti-war and anti-nuclear origins of the party. Sam, I'll bring you in here. What did you make of the SNP's reaction to John Healy's resignation?
Well, I've not had a broad review of the SNP's reaction across its whole ranks, but certainly that statement from Doogan I did find disappointing, not least because there are enormous open goals for the SNP to exploit here that don't involve trying to attack right on the issue of military spending, attack right to compared to Labour, that is. And one open goal, I think, is taking advantage of the fact of their party policy of opposing possessing nuclear weapons. Now, why do I say that? Because only in the preceding week before Healy resigned, we learned that Britain is now the third largest military spender on nuclear weapons, that is, in the entire world, having now surpassed Russia. I'll remind our listeners, Russia is the country that possesses 45% roughly of the world's nuclear arsenal. And as far as I'm aware, it operates a nuclear triad, which we only have one component of. Not that I'm remotely jealous of it. But we spend more than Russia, and we are very close to spending as much as China in real terms. We already spend, in terms of a per GDP basis, more nuclear weapons than any country except the United States. Now, it would be very interesting to know whether Dave Doogan supports that. I mean, maybe he doesn't, but I'm not getting the impression that he thinks that that's a woeful misallocation of resources from that statement that he made. And, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's a woeful misallocation of resources, both from a moral basis and a military basis, because we also learned just in the past week or so that all of the 5 existing Royal Navy nuclear-powered Astute submarines, which are classified as nuclear weapons, by the way, even though they're not nuclear-armed, are berthed awaiting maintenance, meaning that there are none at sea to escort or protect the nuclear missile Vanguard submarines. All this while the cost of the replacement Dreadnought submarines continues to spiral with increasing delays and technical obstacles in construction. They're due to cost well over £40 billion to produce, and they're years past their initial targets. Meanwhile, the Public Audit Committee in Westminster has discovered that £6.1 billion has been misaccounted by the Atomic Weapons Establishment based in Aldermaston, going back to 2007, right? It's been misclassified as assets instead of spending, from what I understand. And that same committee is calling for greater transparency mechanisms because they're so at a loss with the existing published information, so censored it is by classifications, and just opacity, basically, that they're of the view that UK spending on nuclear weapons just simply cannot be properly scrutinized or challenged, right? So there's a massive story under the surface here about woefully inefficient investment and procurement, costs spiraling out of control, nuclear weapons being a black hole budget, right? Something which Dominic Cummings has been writing about for a very long time now, and which he's proven to be vindicated on, by the way, as much as we might not appreciate his other political interventions. And, also very importantly, legacy military technologies becoming increasingly obsolete as we're witnessing on various battlefields. Those are all the things, those are all the questions that Healy should have asked and answered and did not. And instead, his proposal was just to ask for infinity more money, right? For all of these collapsing mega projects within the MOD. So I think that's the line of attack that the SNP should have taken, especially given that their membership also, oppose nuclear weapons. But what we've seen instead is Duggan trying to take an opportunity to seem more credible as a spokesman for Scotland's defence, and buying into the same false narratives about why defence spending needs a dramatic spike at the cost of public provision in this country, which is really disappointing.
Quite. Rory, I'll bring you in here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to link this back to the previous answer that I gave, and I think Sam's right to connect this sort of outrage about the defence investment plan, and link that to the Britain now being the third largest global spender on nuclear weapons. I'm going to take a number here that we worked on this week in Commonweal, is that Britain, every single man, woman, and child in Britain was charged the equivalent of 180 quid for the development of nuclear weapons. And that is all to not even have the capacity to decide what we do with the nuclear weapons ourselves, because the delivery system is rented from the US. And I think, it's hard to take the British establishment seriously, or even the defence establishment seriously, when they've lobbied relentlessly for enormous increases in military spending and have then spent it on nuclear capability, which is precisely then the reason that we can't actually defend ourselves in other scenarios in the first place, right? Not only that, but this National Audit Office report that you found, it identified that the nuclear industry in Britain thrives on secrecy and opaque accounting, and in this context, we take thrive to mean profiteers enormously through the monopolistic supply chains, lack of scrutiny, and a black check mindset. There is no obvious use for nuclear weapons, and Britain's nuclear weapons have nothing to do with the defence of Britain. Often, I think the UK military seems entirely disinterested in defending Britain. Instead, they want to spend their money in a way that suggests what it really prioritizes is foreign adventurism. The fact that we as an island nation only have 2 aircraft carriers is ridiculous to try and explain. The fact that we have military bases around the world are purely colonial relics. And I think a lot of this is again just positioning for this financial relationship to the military industry and this relationship that we have with the US. To expand, I think I'd probably say, if you imagine the Ministry of Defence being run like the NHS, right? Senior NHS managers would have been found to have been wasteful, inefficient, and lacking transparency over and over again, and insufficiently concerned about large-scale fraud and repeatedly incapable of managing its own budget. And now imagine that those same managers tell you that the way to clear this backlog of waiting lists in cancer care and heart disease, etc., is to quote unquote enhance the reputation of the service by buying its management sports cars. And then if anybody asks the question of like whether sports cars are actually effective in reducing cancer waiting lists, the managers tell you that you're ignorant, you're irresponsible, and you're putting the lives of every citizen at direct risk. And so the speaker, are, somewhat dangerously naive, and they might even call you a traitor for wanting to reduce these cancer waiting times. I think this is the scenario that we're in with the UK defence. The military never take responsibility for inflaming global tensions, but they expect a quick profit when those tensions do rise. And then they also get to define what those tensions mean, right? They get to define the only way in which they think we should mitigate the risks of a dangerous world. And if they say it means a nuclear submarine, then we can't question that.
Yes, brilliant. Quite right. I think a perfect analogy, Rory. Briefly on this, I think it is important to say that what we're watching is a broader trend that is very, very concerning, right? And that's as follows. What you have is John Healey destabilising a democratically elected Prime Minister on behalf of the arms and defence industry, right? That's objectively what happens. I don't like Keir Starmer. Nobody likes Keir Starmer, but the reality is John Healey has made his position particularly vulnerable, and John Healey has acted perhaps in his own self-interest, but in reality on behalf of the defence contractors with whom the defence ministry is very, very close. Robin Cook, the former Foreign Secretary, used to say that BAE Systems had a key to the back door of number 10, and they still do. So John Healey, using his position in Cabinet to advocate consistently for their interests, to funnel more public money to the likes of BAE Systems, and when push comes to shove, resigning in a move that will only aid their profits. So what we are seeing is the development of the war economy at the expense of democracy, right? This is an ascendant block within the British economy, powerful and multinational, which has its fingers and tentacles spread out across a variety of different places. We know that in Scotland there was the defence investment and the defence supply chain and procurement summit hosted just a couple of weeks ago in Glasgow, where both representatives from the Scottish Government on behalf of Scottish Enterprise and Douglas Alexander on behalf of the UK Government addressed a host of arms dealers, right? Like, so these people are embedding themselves very, very deeply in sectors across the country, and what the result is an ascendant and very powerful bloc, as I said, in the Scottish economy, which has been able to leverage its economic might and wealth to attract huge sums of public money as a result of its lobbying efforts, right, which we know accelerated in the run-up to Keir Starmer's announcement of that increased defence spending in 2025. And this story this week is an extension of that, where you have had Healey pull himself out of Cabinet, acting on behalf, we can only assume, of BAE Systems and others. And yes, it's dressed up in concerns around the strategic security of the British state, but it's nothing more than acting on behalf of those weapons companies, and it will have damaging implications for democracy, coming in the same week as the Fulton Four are charged with criminal damage and sentenced as terrorists. The British state again protecting weapons companies at the expense of the right to a free and fair trial. And we know again the extent of lobbying that was done by weapons companies around Palestine Action over a protracted period of time. So I think that, again, particularly salient points, and good that as Scotia we discussed them. Let's move briefly, I think, onto a final story today about the response to the rise of the far right across Britain. We saw thousands of people take to the streets of Glasgow city centre on Saturday in response to the scenes we saw on Tuesday, where roving groups of masked men attacked people of colour in Glasgow city centre in really deeply traumatic scenes. A word or two briefly on the scenes and the response to them, first from you, Rory.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been a concerning week. It feels like a return as sort of to some of the National Front demonstrations, but it's not as if the far right's ever actually particularly gone away in that sense. I think rather than linger on the depressing actions of these thugs who the BBC this week described as anti-immigration campaigners quite egregiously, and I thought Ross Greer challenged that quite well on the radio, actually, I have to say. I'll give him his flowers for that. yeah, rather than dwell on them, I would just say that the response from the people of Glasgow was wonderful to see. The thousands of people who took the streets, I think they outnumbered the the thugs about 10 to 1, something like that. But that's not without me knowing full proper numbers. Um, and I think I would just, if people are feeling despaired in this scenario, I would just urge them to go and organize and join a group to organize. Not necessarily sort of an anti-racism group in that way, but more of that crucial community organizing that connects up some of the material struggles of people to the bigger picture. For example, I think the campaign to bring back night buses and the Get Me Home Safely campaign is a great example of taking some concrete steps to quote unquote protect women and girls, right? When sexual assaults in Glasgow, at night reached extremely high levels. That's the sort of stuff that actually, if these people wanted to make a difference, then they would. And those are the sorts of concrete material actions that we can do to support each other. And so, yeah, that would be my message.
Sam, what about you?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Obviously, the scenes that we saw were totally disgraceful. But as Rory said, the response the other day with that kind of counter demonstration that was organized by anti-racism organizers was really, really impressive. I think they looked like there were thousands of people there. And it was done, I imagine, on quite a quick turnaround. And so I just want to give plaudits to the organizers, the people that mobilized that, and also to point out that, it takes gumption to go into the city center of Glasgow to face down a bunch of guys dressed in black wearing balaclavas, not knowing really what the balance of forces is actually going to be there, not knowing how the police are going to behave. So I just want to give huge credit to everyone that turned out there and made that statement. It was a very powerful statement. And that, we should continue to support those efforts.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that Rory mentioned the media coverage, and what is striking is the failure on a whole host of platforms, mainstream platforms, for them to be able to say the word loyalist and acknowledge the roots of this stuff. And the organised core that spreads it, and the network through which these organisations and mobilisations, I should say, were brought together, which is striking and an abject failure, and one which skews our analysis and prevents a proper account of the facts of Tuesday's demonstration being given, and does everyone a disservice. But I think we will leave it there because we are well past time as ever. Thanks very much to Rory and Sam for coming on. I think it's been a very, very good episode, again, covering the stories you won't find elsewhere, which gives me a nice opportunity to plug that fundraiser. Again, if you have those £5 at the end of the month, we would love to have them. If you don't, leave us a review on Spotify. We'll be more than content with that. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, enjoy the football. See you all soon.